We had a distinguished panel this morning. Really happy to have the one identifier that former Governor Perdue forgot to mention over there. She, of course, was the governor here, served for 4 years, elected in 2008. Before that, she was lieutenant governor, and she also worked in the legislature for many years. And she was governor when North Carolina adopted the Common Core standards, and when the state was one of the first in the nation to win a federal Race to the Top grant. And next to her, we have the current Lieutenant Governor, Dan Forrest. Pleased to have you with us. And as I understand it, you were first elected to public office in 2012?
That's correct.
Okay. And so he's an architect by trade, but I did notice, did a little digging, there's a little bit of politics in your family. I saw that your mother was in the U.S. House of Representatives for almost 20 years and was mayor of Charlotte as well. The Lieutenant Governor has been talking a lot over the past year about the Common Core standards and has become one of the leading critics, I would say, among the political leadership in the state on that issue, and we'll hear plenty more from him about that this morning, I'm sure. And finally, on the end of the panel, we have Senator John Legg of Florida, who is a former educator, or you're a certified teacher, right? And in fact, you're still involved with a charter school that he helped to found in, I believe it's Pasco County. And he is the chairman of the K-12 Education Committee in Florida in the state Senate, and before that, chaired the Education Committee in the state House. So he's a key player in that state on all decisions around education, including the Common Core, which I know he's written about and talked about with many folks in Florida. I wanted to give just a few stage-setting remarks here to get things going. As we mentioned, this is called Taking Political Stock of the Common Core. And there's a lot to take stock of right now, especially in the South. The last year has seen an incredible amount of activity, political activity in the South. It's probably safe to say it's become ground zero for criticism of the Common Core and pushback that's mainly in this area been led by Republicans and conservatives who, for various reasons, are uncomfortable with the standards and or how they came about. And we've seen over the past year a number of states taking action. 3 states so far, the initial coalition was 45 states in the District of Columbia. 3 states have since repealed their adoption, including South Carolina and Oklahoma. And then several other states have either declared a review, such as what's happening in North Carolina, where the legislature and the lieutenant governor will help explain this, but as I understand it, they basically said we need to create, evaluate those standards and reinvent them or change them significantly, maybe even start from scratch, and we'll talk about that. And there's a panel that's been established in the state to do that work. Several other states, in fact, most states in the South, the political leadership is talking about a review of the standards. Leaders in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Tennessee, the governor has created a review process, and I know people were able to submit comments on a State Department website. And what was interesting there was they were saying, be specific. Don't just say repeal the standards. Tell us what standards you don't like and how you change them. And I think that I think that's a legitimate place to go, because sometimes it seems that some of the criticism is very grounded in what the standards say, but sometimes you'll hear people criticize it, and when you ask what exactly they want to change, it's not always clear. So I hope we'll explore that in more detail today, too. We also have so as I say, if you look across the South, many of these states are now either calling explicitly for a review or that's likely to happen. And so it's going to be interesting to ask where that leads, and what does it mean to call for a review, and what is the state supposed to do, and what are educators supposed to do. Meanwhile, we also have the rollout in most states this spring of Common Core testing, and there too there's been a sea change. A year or 2 ago, almost every state had decided to go with one or another of a common assessment. There was 2 consortia of states, 2 coalitions that had come together to develop common shared assessments. And early in the game, it seemed that most states would participate in one or the other. Now, the situation is totally different. Only about, I think at last count, 27 states were going to use either the PARCC or Smarter Balance tests. Many other states, especially in the South, have decided against that, including North Carolina, which initially was going to be a Smarter Balance state. Florida was going to be a PARCC state, I believe. And many of the other states in this part of the country, at least for the time being, have decided to go their own way with testing. So I'll stop there with the introduction. Oh, I'll say just one other thing, which is that the recent elections have also may have created more momentum for the critics of the standards, as Republicans made gains in quite a few states at the state legislature level and governor's levels. In fact, we have a new governor from Arkansas. There was a Democrat who's now replaced by a Republican. You have new Republican majority in one or both chambers of the legislature in West Virginia. But for the most part, in most southern states, it's a Republican governor with a Republican-led legislature. So with that, I want to start with former Governor Bev Perdue. Maybe you can just quickly tell us why did North Carolina adopt the standards in the first place, and what do you make of the backlash in North Carolina and the South more broadly?
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I was governor, and so I see things through the lens of my term as governor and my work for years on the State Board of Education, and I too chaired the Senate Education Committee. So I've been involved in education, plus I was a teacher, so I see things perhaps differently. North Carolina was an early adopter of the Common Core. I believe, from my own background, that every kid in the country deserves a world-class education. And that's the preeminent overriding premise of Common Core, is that if we set our standards high, if we benchmark them by international valuations, and if we then figure out a pathway for kids across the country to have an ability to meet these high standards, they'll be globally competitive. We in North Carolina went further than many of the other states did. We put into place an initiative called College Promise, Career College Promise, Ready, Set, Go. It had 3 or 4 overall goals. One of the goals was to make sure that kids stayed on grade level. And the General Assembly has held true to that premise. They're trying to make sure if you're in 3rd grade, you can read at 3rd grade level. Makes sense. We wanted to increase the high school graduation rate, and we wanted to see more of our students as they leave high school enter a career or a college pathway. And we've been exceedingly successful in doing that. As I left the governor's office, 80% of the kids in our public schools and private schools graduated high school, the highest number in the history of the state. And a lot of that was wrapped around what we did in terms of growing capacity on the ground. Many of the other states, y'all, just laid it out there, and they said, this is how it's going to be. It's a mandate, and you have to do what we tell you. And that's the wrong way to do things from my perspective as an educator, as a governor. We built capacity with workshops and lesson plans and webinars, all this stuff all over the state. So a lot of parents understood, a lot of teachers understood, so we had buy-in from the ground up. We went a step further, one of the very few states in the country that implemented a pre-K through 20 assessment plan in a way that we can use the data consistently from pre-K through 20. I can't tell you how I feel about the political discussion across the country. And I talk to many of my friends who are governors or former governors about the political rhetoric. I think it's a shame for the future of this country and for our children that somehow we've lost the energy around trying to make sure our kids are world prepared and ready to compete globally. And we've turned it into a political dialogue. So I'm very willing to take part and continue to take part in this political discussion. But at the end of the day, it's our kids. I went into a 2nd grade classroom, Eric, Friday, in preparation just to see it again, to be sure I was on the right track supporting Common Core. And 2nd grade, a world-class teacher teaching these kids about math. They had a worksheet with 18 solutions to come up with the number 56. And I listened to little 6- and 7-year-olds sit around on rugs telling me the way to get to 56 and how you had 4 piles of 10 and 16 piles of 1, or on and on and on. And I left that classroom thinking these kids think differently than I did. They've got analytical, problem-solving thinking skills at 6 or 7. And that's what the world is going to require. That's what you all have to have in your jobs. That's what these little kids who are going to start work in a world that none of us can fathom have to have. And I believe it's the responsibility of you all to get that message out there. If you can embrace this concept, call it whatever you want. I don't care if it's Common Core or whatever. Let every state do what they want, because we will. But at least if some states repeal Common Core and these high standards, let the parents and the citizens of their states stand up and mandate that whatever they replace it with has even higher standards than the Common Core.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor, do you want to give your own take on this? Is this political rhetoric or something more for you?
Sure, thank you, Eric. And first, welcome to North Carolina, everybody. We're glad you're here, and thank you for taking an interest in this. Just quickly, you guys really are on the just on the ground level with this and being able to communicate to everybody very transparently what's going on with education in general. And I think this is very helpful dialogue, and perhaps a little too late in a lot of ways. And the reason that we're even here having this conversation years after Common Core was established. And I think that part of the challenge is truly having transparency when it comes to issues like this in education. I would say that Common Core is not partisan. I have talked to liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, independents, and everything in between. I've talked to teachers who like Common Core, teachers who can't stand Common Core, parents who are frustrated with Common Core, parents who don't even know what it is, across the board. And so I think a lot of it is, how do we get information out in a way that makes sense, and how do we not discard, especially parents and teachers, when they have questions about issues related to Common Core? How do you not marginalize them and push them over to the side and say, well, these are myths and misperceptions about Common Core. This is political rhetoric. When a parent comes to you and says, I have no idea, I can't even help my 3rd grade student with math anymore. And I got this 1,000 times. And this was a daily issue in our office, where parents were calling, and you'd meet people in the streets and say, I can't even help my kids with math in the 3rd grade. When those things happen, you start to raise questions. You say, why is it this way? What are the things that have changed? And how did we get where we are today? And so you can't just dismiss questions of parents. In the education world, for those of you that are educators and cover education, we talk all the time about the desire to get parents engaged in the education of their students. And then at the same time, we put up a wall and say, your question is not valid. Just go along with what we said, because we think it's good for your kids. And so I think we have to open up that conversation. And when we got engaged in this process, we started asking questions to educators and the teachers and the people, and they started coming back to us with questions. And we came up with a list of 67 questions that we sent to the Department of Public Instruction. We said, will you please help us understand Common Core? And we sent them that list, and we got back boxes and boxes and reams of paper, about 40,000 pieces of paper and other information that we couldn't even calculate because it was coming on disk drives and all kinds of things. And we came up with a number. So it was about 600 pages of documentation for every single question that we asked. And not one question was answered. We did not get one question answered. So we just came away with a lot more questions. And so that's part of the transparency process. And just to respond to Governor Perdue, and I also want to say, the governor's been working on education. She's a teacher. That's her background. She loves kids because she comes from a background of teaching. And everybody I know in politics loves these kids. And we all want what is best for kids. I don't know anybody on either side of the aisle. So when you hear rhetoric of one party is against education and one party is for education, that's just a bunch of bunk. Don't believe that for a second. Go meet with these people and see how these individuals, like the senator next to me and the governor next to me, have really devoted their entire lives and careers to help young people learn and to help get equality and equity into the education system. And so when we throw things out that do become rhetorical, we need to be able to respond to them. Things like rigor. I've asked that question a million times. I know you've probably all written about it. What does rigor mean? Why are these standards more rigorous than past standards? What does that mean? Internationally benchmarked. That's another term that's been thrown out there. We've asked this question all over the country to people. What does internationally benchmarked mean? What are you benchmarking against? I have not, to this day, had a sufficient answer to what was Common Core internationally benchmarked against, because we say we're trying to raise our standards for a globally competitive world. And so I think we have to be able to answer those things. And then to say that I am a firm believer in high standards. I've said this from the beginning in North Carolina, that whatever comes out of this commission, by the way, Eric, just to answer your question quickly, is that the commission was established to review the standards. It's up to the commission to do what they do. If they keep them as they are, that's the commission's responsibility. They can keep any portion of it. They can get rid of any portion of it. If there are things that are developmentally inappropriate, they can get rid of those. They can adjust math if they need to. So those kind of things are in the mix for that commission. So all of this stuff's on the table. It always seems to bring up more questions than answers, but I'm a huge proponent of the highest standards in the world. I think North Carolina should have the highest standards in the world. I think there's validity in the concept of having standards that everybody can understand. But I also am a believer that our 50 states can also be innovation laboratories, and we can learn from other states, like Massachusetts. We could go to Massachusetts and learn from them. We can go to California. We can go to Kentucky, and we can learn from what they've done in the standards world without taking a one-size-fits-all approach to standards. I'm sorry for the long answer, but there's a lot of things going on there at the beginning, so I'm sure we'll get honed in.
Great, thank you. Senator Legg, do you want to say a little bit about your perspective on where Common Core is in your state and some of the political tests that it's faced there?
Sure, and for those of you, I'm John Legg, I'm from Florida. I've been in the Florida legislature about 10 years now, and I started when, at that time, Governor Bush was governor. And so Florida has a very unique perspective, I guess, from the South, because now we have 4 presidential candidates coming from our state. So, so this issue is really being looked at under a microscope. But to start with, and I traveled the state asking, really kind of having an open ear on, what is the opposition to the standards. And I'm going to kind of break the language down a little bit, because I think the language is probably a lot of the problem. I don't know what Common Core means to people, because the word Common Core means a lot of different things. And I found Common Core means 5 separate things to different people. Common Core means standards to some people. Common Core means assessments to some people. Common Core means curriculum to some people. Common Core means technology to some people. And Common Core also means professional development to some people. There are 5 separate issues. And so when you say the word Common Core, are you for, are you for or against Common Core? I asked them to be a little bit more specific in what do you mean. Are you supportive of the standards? And what we found in Florida is evolving in its discussion. I don't see backlash on standards, even from the hard Tea Party individuals, because we put out a call for a review of the standards, and we listed all the standards point by point on what the standards were, and asked for individuals around the state to comment on the standard, the specific standard, and gave a window for that standard for them to fill in the blank on what their opinion was of that standard, where it should be, and we received about, I believe it was about 13,000 comments, with only a handful that actually had actual comments on the standards. And as a result, though, there were some very legitimate concerns when it came to calculus, dealing with currency, some other issues that we made, and I forget the exact number, but some 50-odd changes to our standard to make them the Florida standards. And we believe, we believe are strong, and I have not heard any pushback on the standards, or any articulate pushback on the standards, because those have been kind of adopted. Yeah, these are good standards, and move forward. The curriculum issue, obviously, there was some argumentatively questionable, because someone will have a book and it has the word Common Core on it and says, see, this is what you're teaching my 2nd grader, which is not taught in any school in Florida. It's not taught by any teacher in Florida. It's by some publisher out west that put a label on it that says Common Core already, and it goes around the internet, and this is what you're teaching our kids. So we went through we went through the standard argument, we went through the curriculum argument, realizing that curriculum is all based at the local level, that they can decide what they want to do. where are we now in Florida and kind of what are we wrestling with is the assessment issue. And I want to be very clear, assessment is not synonymous with testing. And so getting that language to understand what is the difference between assessment and testing, and where do we assess, where do we test, what do we use the assessment, what do we use the test for. I'm an avid reader of Tony Wagner at Harvard, and kind of where we're going with that. Florida's looking at going into that direction of how can we make sure that we meet certain benchmarks but still allow for innovation to take place. And then the two kind of underpinning, which is really hard for us as legislators in Florida not to push forward with, is dealing with the professional development side. As a legislator, I don't want to be the person to give professional development. That's for the professionals in the educational field to do. But as a legislature, as Oscar Wilde says, I can resist everything but temptation. So we're going to mess with it, because that's what we do as legislators. So we're going to, professional development. How do we, as professional development, how do our teachers teach us this advanced way of learning, or this even new style of learning? And that is a real significant challenge, because the world that I live in is not the same world that my child lives in. My child lives in a different world that I live in, and he needs to be, or at least I believe he needs to be educated differently than the way I was educated. And so how do we come to grips with that? And then the final piece of Common Core that we talk about, what we're wrestling with in Florida, is technology. And I say it's not cheap, it's expensive, and parents won't know how to use it, but the kids do. And I'm not saying that in a flippant way. Technology is no longer a device that a child uses. Technology is inside the child. My daughter cannot live without technology. I'm not talking about just Facebook. She is a news consumer. She knows news the second you tweet about it. Matter of fact, Sunday morning papers are obsolete for us because we read about them Friday nights. It's that world. They live in technology. So how do we bring our schools to that technology level, to where it is advanced and children know how to use it, and our teachers know how to use it in there, and to use it to advance forward. So to answer your question, that's what we're wrestling with, is how do you define Common Core? And as I traveled the state, and I went all around our state, did massive town hall meetings with lots of Tea Party forums and stuff. And when I put those 5 issues up, we walked out of the room with a significant number of the opposition in Florida really pushed down and saying, well, I have concern about testing. And then in Florida, we can talk about testing. We can talk about technology. We can talk about a standard. But to talk about Common Core, you're just kind of, the dog is chasing his tail. So.
Thank you. I want to make a few quick notes. First off, I neglected to mention earlier, unfortunately, one of our panelists could not join us today. We had also invited Michael McShane from the American Enterprise Institute, and over the weekend he got ill and had to reluctantly say he can't join us. So we're sorry that he's not here as well. There was the mention of the math problem that went viral, and I forgot to mention it was actually, as I understand it, in North Carolina, where that famous math problem that an engineer said, my second grader brought home this math problem, and I can't even solve it, and I'm an engineer. And then that was one of the pieces that may have helped build up some of the political attention to this issue. It was picked up by Glenn Beck and by a comedian, and so then you suddenly had this issue on a national, even televised stage in some respects. So that's an interesting thing to think about. What I wanted to, I think I'll circle back for a moment, and one thing too, that these were great sort of ways for you also to help set the stage. I would ask now that you try to keep your answers to a minute or less. No, I'm serious, because that way we're going to be able to get to a lot of questions from the audience, and we can really have a good dialogue. So, so then this is going to put you on the spot, Lieutenant Governor, to give sort of the short version of, are there specific standards that you think are problematic? And can you identify, what kind of concerns you have about what the actual content of the standards?
Again, that all I think has to be couched in a much broader question. Just like what was laid out here is that it's not just about standards, and Common Core is not just about standards. It is about assessments. It is about curriculum. It is about changing pedagogy in education. And so when you ask questions like, what is the exact standard? I mean, you could sit down and, that's like the assessments group or the standards group is doing now and say, well, that's their job to do that. I would say at the lower levels, there is a good bit of concern about developmentally appropriate or inappropriate nature of standards at the lower level. You talk about rigor and you push those standards down to lower and lower levels. At some point, they become developmentally inappropriate. There was a group of 500 early childhood educators that signed on to a document very early on in Common Core and said, these standards at this level are inappropriate for students of this age. That was never addressed. That needs to be addressed now. And because I'm speaking in generalities in a minute here, at the upper levels, I would say we have some challenges with preparing our kids for STEM work. It's been mentioned by the writers of Common Core themselves that if you want to do calculus in your first year of college, you got to do more work than Common Core provides. That's fine. I mean, but we need to understand that our students need to be able to advance at rapid paces, especially in math and science. And I'm a big fan of mastery-based or competency-based learning, and I think that's the direction we need to go to beyond the standards. If we say the standard is the low bar, then allowing these students through the tools that we put into our education system to advance in a mastery way as fast as possible, so we're preparing them for their STEM careers.
Okay, I actually want to ask one last question to you now before we move on. Do you, for your part, see this as tinkering around the edges of the standards, or something you think needs a full-scale rewrite?
Well, again, I would leave that to the professionals who are working on it right now, rather than me saying what needs to be, fully rewritten or what needs to be addressed. But I think that at the very least, we definitely need to have transparency in the process. I think if you went out to the people that are against this now, they would say that, they'd ask questions like, why did we roll it out to all grades at one time? Why didn't we vet these standards? Why didn't we go through a process of rolling it out to a school here and a school there and understanding where the problems were and the challenges were and bringing it back and say, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's fix that piece and then rolling it out. What we did in North Carolina, we said, here it is, everybody, all at once, all grades at one time, and then we start to deal with the challenges that are faced when we do that. And so that's part of where we are now, is just developing that understanding of what happens when you roll it out to everybody at one time.
Okay. Governor Perdue, do you think were mistakes made in the implementation in your state, whether it was the way you rolled it out or the way that you prepared the public educators for it as well? What's your sense? Is that part of the problem here, that the implementation just didn't go right in North Carolina?
I don't think the implementation was necessarily the problem anywhere in the country. I think the key issue that I've talked with my friends at Ed Post about is that the whole rollout was ill-conceived. There was very little background across the country. There were very few public forums. There was really very little work with America's Press Corps about what the reasons were and what the philosophy of Common Core is or was at that time. And so basically, by the time you got down to the governor's levels, most of us were also supportive of the concept of higher standards and an international benchmark. And I agree with the lieutenant governor and the senator that the language isn't what's important. But I can't look back and think that there was anything wrong with the rollout here or in any other state. I am watching with interest what's going on now in South Carolina as they try to go back and totally rewrite the Common Core. Other states that are talking about doing that have begun to see that the benchmarks that Common Core, whatever you call Common Core, has set in place are really the guideposts, the foundation for any other kind of higher standard. And so it's going to be an interesting exercise in the country as folks try to change them and folks commit to higher standards and folks do the rollout. Our rollout in terms of building capacity was fairly sophisticated, and I'm pleased with how that went for the most part. Although I have a daughter-in-law who hates Common Core. She's got a kid and she hates it because she can't do the math. But I pay great respect to the senator who said he needs to have his child educated differently than he was educated. So maybe the parents need to think a little bit about how we can teach ourselves to teach our kids the way they need to learn in the 21st century.
And Governor, are you comfortable with a review panel now going through the standards and possibly revising them?
Surely. I don't have any problem with the review panel. Are they funded yet, Lieutenant Governor?
Not fully, no.
The panel itself, I don't believe, has adequate resources, and that's an issue. I just think you have to be sure if you're going to do these reviews that you have somebody who knows something about what they're doing.
Right.
And I wouldn't be able to do it. Maybe there are other governors who could do it, but I think you have to bring a real good team of people who understand the content and the skills and the mastery.
It is worth noting that the standards were adopted or finalized and mostly adopted in 2010, and now we're in 2015, which is not that far off from when many states would actually consider revising their own standards. So even while there's definitely a strong, I think, political element to what's happening right now, in the normal course of things, some of these states might well be at least approaching the point where they would do take a second look. I want to now, though, go out to the audience. Please, again, any question, just please identify yourself. I got plenty of questions, but I'll give you guys a minute. Yes.
Hi, I'm Shayna with Chalkbeat. Senator Legg, I was curious what you meant when you said assessment is not testing. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. The assessment is not synonymous with testing, because when someone says testing, right away in a parent's mind, I'm using it from my nomenclature, it is the Scantron, it's sitting behind a computer, and then, okay, here are 25 questions, here are my results. An assessment in an educational world can be a portfolio. It is a measurement of trying to understand and quantify the learning. And we hear this a lot, or I hear, Florida has a kind of a different structure. We have 67, some very large school districts. And we have this internal concern right now in Florida where we tell every grade needs to have an assessment in every subject area. So what does that mean to some individuals? That means we need a standardized test for kindergarten in 7 subject areas. Absolutely not. I mean, absolutely not. But yet, in some people's mind, well, you said it's an assessment in every grade. That's what the statute says. Well, the assessment means can you quantify their learning in that grade level and in those subject areas? Is that a portfolio? Is it another type of measurement that can be used? And so working through, and I guess I'm a little bit more of a turtle and pragmatic in thinking this. I don't think it's that complicated, and I think we as bureaucrats, as educator bureaucrats, we make it more complicated in saying, well, we've always done assessments, but how are those assessments now being utilized and documented? And that does not necessarily equal a test. That means that's, and there are some districts that do that in our area, in some schools, where that kindergartner is going to have to take a test in every subject area, in every grade, and that's, and at least in our state, that's not the same.
Might I?
Oh, sure.
In North Carolina, because of the commitment to keep kids on grade level, we implemented an initiative in K through 3, I think, maybe just 1 through 3. That did the formative assessment. That's a cool word. You don't use it in your writing. The formative assessment means that the teacher or the assistant actually works with Johnny or Susie in real time and puts some kind of device in front of the teacher, and the kid might read, and you can figure out the kid doesn't know these 3 words. And it prints out a lesson plan for the child that day in real time to then work on. That's what an assessment is. It's something that you do in real time to help improve the capacity of the child based on the standard. That's what I saw Friday in that classroom. There were kids who were changing how they thought because they were learning different ways in real time. It wouldn't have done any good, probably, if the teacher had waited till this morning and given them a test. Test and assessment are 2 different words.
If I may as well,
Sure.
because it's going to be a hot topic, and I agree. This is really something that we're going to hear a lot more of in the near future. When we talk about at the board level high stakes testing, and the superintendents talk about high stakes testing. You know, you've all heard these stories of my student's really good at X, but they're really poor test taker. And you get to the end of a grade or an end of a class or an end of a subject, and you take this high stakes test, and Johnny or Susie doesn't do very good on that test. That really doesn't necessarily mean they're not good in that subject or they don't know that information really well. And so mastery-based or competency-based education, if you think about it in terms of mathematics or like Khan Academy online, which I know you're all familiar with Khan Academy, you don't move on to the next concept till you master that previous concept. You can move on, but then it'll take you back again if you don't get the next concept. So allowing our students to be assessed along the way by their teachers is really important, and that's really what we're trying to get to, and get away from so much of the high-stakes testing that when you get to the end of the year, you fail the test, but so what? You get advanced to the next grade anyway. The teachers have no ability to go back and help that student learn what they need to learn before they go on to the next grade. And so that's why this assessment model of real time, which technology allows for now, for really the first time in the history of the world, technology allows us to happen. And that's some of the changes that we're trying to make here in North Carolina as well.
Thank you. Other questions out there? Yes, and identify yourself, please.
I'm Dee Amos with Florida Times Union. In Florida, teachers' paychecks are linked to test scores, and over-testing is the big word. How do you do that and still try to get people to embrace quote-unquote common standards? I mean, how do you do that, link their pay to an assessment, and then say that's not an important assessment?
And you know, those are definitely, that's one of the real challenges that we're handling in Florida is Florida was very eager about teacher evaluation, which is something that, you know, I believe we're still going to embrace going forward. But what you're going to see in Florida is probably a more understanding of student data needs to be a component. So what percentage of that component should it equal? Florida has had that 50% benchmark of it needs to equal 50% plus for the evaluation. You know, I've been of the impression of a long time that, you know, we come up with this number of 50%. You know, where is that magic number? Student component should be a portion of it, because we want to ensure and have a gauge, because you want truth in advertising for that student. In Florida anyways, we're going to be discussing this session of where is that line? How much of that teacher evaluation should be dependent upon a student-based data, and then what would quantify that student data, and what should suffice us for that?
Can I just add something about the assessment issue too? I know that Lieutenant Governor earlier was exactly right when he said, certainly, and I didn't mean to suggest that the criticism of Common Core is only coming from one side politically. It's coming from across the spectrum in different ways. Although I think on the political left side of the spectrum, what you're hearing about is the concern of the connection between the standards and the testing and how those tests are used. And that's become a flashpoint in places like New York and other states where you have educators saying, wait a minute, so now we have new standards, we have a new teacher evaluation system, and now we have new assessments that are going to be tied to those standards, and you're going to count my student scores this year on that, throwing all these things at me at one time has created a lot of concern, frankly, among a lot of teachers, even teachers who are big fans of the Common Core, but also others. You've seen, some leading Democrats who have raised concerns about that. Looks like, did you have something you wanted to add? Oh, sorry, it looked like you were...
I was agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. Other questions?
But one of the points that I would urge you all to continue to think about and write about, if we do assessments and if we actually help children acquire the skill sets they need, it could be a solution. And a lot of us for a lot of years have been looking for a solution to the chronically low-performing school systems and children, poor, race. You all understand what I'm talking about, that there are groups of children that many of us have been trying to figure out solutions for years. How do kids in poor neighborhoods have the equity in learning that a kid in Charlotte or New York or California has? And that has to be one of the undergirding reasons for the buy-in on Common Core. Because we thought if the standards were embraced as a country, that we would come up as a country with solutions to tackle these enormous challenges. Because in a global economy, we can't afford to write off 25% of the future workers in this country. You can't. That's why the business community has been so supportive of all of these higher standard initiatives.
Thank you. Let's see, we had a few different people. Was someone responding directly to the governor? We'll start with that then, and introduce yourself.
I'm Jeff Solchek with the Tampa Bay Times in Florida. We've tied back to the two questions you just raised about helping the students who are in hard-to-reach areas, and also the idea of assessing students by ways other than tests. if you leave it up to individual schools to sort of assess the way that they assess, do we ever run into the problem then of certain schools assessing so differently that you don't really ever get that way to compare students and see if they're really reaching the standards you want them to reach?
I don't have an answer for that personally. It seems to me like, from my own philosophical point of view, that's one of the reasons I like personally the concept of a common assessment, as long as it's not a test. It's not a high-stakes test, it's an assessment. And if all kids in North Carolina, as they are assessed using a common instrument, then at the end of the day, we should be able to at least factor in some of the things they need to focus on differently.
If I may just relate to that as well, I think it's a combination thing. Again, it's kind of getting to more to the assessments and the testing and the difference between the two. Whereas I think in our state, we're already taking a look at what does this mean? We have too many tests. We test too much. Teachers are teaching to the test too much. They're burdened. They don't have time to teach their class because they're always preparing for the test. Those kinds of things. So I think that we need to have an overall ability, say, at the younger levels, to have an assessment, a national assessment, whether that's Iowa or something like that. At the higher levels, the ACT, where students are benchmarked, and those students then have a benchmark, say, in the 9th grade, and then they can move through their high school years, and they're taking that ACT every single year, and you're watching their growth along the way. That's that standard, if you will, assessment. And then beyond that, you have the standard test, rather. Beyond that, you have the assessments that go on just daily in the classroom, and that's where you're freeing up the teacher to do their job, to be innovative, to do it in the way that they know best how to do it. Free up the classrooms, get the burdens of the mandates off the teachers, allow them to do what they love to do. The reason they're going into teaching is because they love teaching. Allow them to teach, and I think you're going to see some great things happen when you get this burden of high-stakes testing and mandates off their back, and this, as you were mentioning earlier, this evaluation now the teachers have. If I'm going to be judged by this thing, that's all I'm going to spend my time doing. I'm not going to do anything but that. I'm going to make sure that I get a good grade so I get good marks myself as a teacher.
Thank you. It's worth noting, too, on the issue of the frequency of testing, that as Congress convenes this year, there may well be a spirited debate about federal mandates for testing, because it was really the advent of the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 that ushered in required testing in every grade, 3 through 8, and then once in high school. And I know there's some lawmakers who are saying, maybe we don't need that much testing after all. Question up here.
I've got two related questions.
And please identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Lynn Bonner from the News and Observer. I've heard the criticism of Common Core that it really doesn't allow teachers the time for remediation. If a kid is behind, there's no time to catch them up. The teachers are really pressured to get in everything before the test. And if you're falling behind, you're going to lag farther behind. First, could someone address that? Second, what they're talking about here in the assessment commission is, well, Common Core might be too hard for some kids. Maybe we have to have a separate standards for some kids who just can't get to this level. And if that is the result, do you worry about tracking kids?
Well, I'll go first, and Governor, if you want to hit that. I don't think we should have different assessments for different students. I think we certainly need to understand where all our students are, and then we need to work very hard to make sure that they get caught up if they need to get caught up. And again, I'll keep beating that drum of mastery or competency-based learning. It allows some students to move more quickly through curriculum, if you will, or standards, and it allows other students to be able to slow down and take time. One student may be really good in English language arts, but not so good in math. They can slow down a little bit in math and grasp the concepts and then move forward, and they can speed up through English language arts, and they may not be advancing first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade in subject matter. They may be in 8th or 9th grade in math and 7th, 8th grade in English language arts. That should be fine. And so I think one of the things I think we do with Common Core, with the standards discussion in general, is say the standards are it. That's all there is. It's the most important thing we can do in education is have great standards, and that's not the case. Standards are one aspect of teaching. They're one aspect of the whole education system, and we need to get that right. But it's not the end-all, be-all. There are countries that do better than the United States in education that don't have standards at all. So I think we need to put it in its proper place and say it's important, but it's not the end-all, be-all.
Governor, did you want to add something?
I just think that we all realize that if kids have disabilities, especially intense disabilities, that they can't be held necessarily to the same standards. But apart from that one group that are present in all of our school systems, I think every child should be held to a high standard, because if we don't hold a child to a high standard, then we allow that child to have a walk. And that walk will then define his or her life as an adult worker.
Yes, Senator.
And just to kind of get what you're saying, and what I've noticed, at least in my part of the small part of the world, is that what this is for me in Florida, it's become a cultural thing where we're now forced to look ourselves in the mirror and we don't like what we see. And so instead of trying to change the way we look, we try to change the mirror so we can get a different result. And you know, and the reality of, you know, our competitors are doing better than us, and perhaps in Florida we have a reluctance to embrace education as much as maybe some of our sister states in the north. And you know, and I say so, I run some schools, and we talk about this with our parents all the time. The day of your kid coming in at 7:30 and their day of education stopping at 3 o'clock, you're not going to get a very high quality of education at that level. It's going to take more. And you know, and we are looking at trying to be innovative in Florida, of saying, okay, you know, what does blended learning mean? What is part of technology? And I'm not a strong advocate of virtual education to substitute traditional education, but I am a strong advocate of virtual education to augment traditional education. What can we do to enhance our school day and stop looking at education as this siloed approach, is that someone else's job to do, and it stops at 3 o'clock. Then we go home and put on SpongeBob and go to soccer. Because if that's the case, you're going to get that result. Or just change the mirror and then, you know, just deceive ourselves and say we're still number one when we're really probably number 30th.
Do you want to add something?
Yes, that's a great point. We agree here in North Carolina. And when it comes to technology, two fronts to this. One, when it comes to Common Core and technology, we were not ready in North Carolina for the assessment piece. Just to be able to say we can take on smarter, balanced assessments would have cost our state not just a significant amount of money and perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars to get up to speed. We just weren't ready technologically. Governor Perdue and her administration, even prior, has done a phenomenal job of setting up an infrastructure for technology in North Carolina. MCNC is this backbone of fiber optics that goes to every school district and almost every single school in North Carolina. I say regularly, and I'm going to have a little competition here with the senator, that we have the ability in North Carolina to be the very first, and I believe we'll be the first state in the country to have every single classroom connected to high-speed broadband and have one-to-one devices in the hands of every student. A lot of that is not just the work that's going on today, but a lot of the work that went on with Governor Perdue and her administration and prior to get us ready for that. But now we're ready, and you say, well, why is that important? That's important because those students that the governor's talking about that are in districts that don't have the ability to have content and have great teachers and have all the AP subjects, you put that device in their hand that's connected to high-speed broadband in every classroom, and the teachers are trained how to use it effectively. You've put all the knowledge of the world at the fingertips of that student. You put every book in the world at the fingertips of that student, and you want to see education transformed. That's one way that we're going to bridge the socioeconomic divide of education in America, is by doing things like that. And so those things are big, but they're also high dollar expenditures in education. So we're doing that in North Carolina now, and we have to invest in that opportunity. So a lot of things going on in that world that are going to change the way students learn and the way teachers teach.
Other questions? I want to keep some more questions going.
I can't go by without giving my foundation a plug. DigiLearn. Go to DigiLearn. That's exactly what we're about. This is the only solution I've seen in my lifetime that will level the field for poor kids from rural communities or inner city communities. This idea of digital education supplementing the teacher is transformational. I think it's the most important thing happening in education at all levels today. And I think it's where wars, so to speak, will be fought among traditional entities of education, higher ed especially.
There was a question back there. Did you still have your question? Introduce yourself, please.
This is Lisa Ward with WFAE in Charlotte. It's a question for the Lieutenant Governor. If the review committee does come back and there's, it's basically tweaks, they've changed the calculus portion and maybe tweak some things on early years, would you still have concerns about North Carolina's version of Common Core standards?
Well, I mean, that's their job to do that. They're the experts in that. I'm not the expert in standards. So their job is to go out and get all the questions answered, to go out to the teachers and to the administrators and to the parents out there and raise all those questions to be able to adjust the standards to be the best standards in the country or the best standards in the world. So when they come back with their report, I'm going to trust that they have done their job at that point. And as you move forward, going forward, then you'll keep making adjustments as we always have in standards. Every set of standards we've ever done in North Carolina that passed has said they're rigorous and they're preparing our kids for college and career. Every time we've done it, we've said that. Well, what does that mean? Just last week, or this last week in State Board of Education, DPI finally came up, Department of Public Instruction, for those of you not North Carolina, came up with a definition for career and college ready. I mean, it's the first time they've had a definition of this, but we've been saying it forever. So, yeah, I'll be fine with whatever they come up with. And one of the challenges I had with Common Core was the copyright that was on them, saying to states, well, here they are, but you can't do anything to change it. Well, you can change it 15%. Yes, what 15% means, and nobody can tell you what changing something 15% is, that there's so many pieces and parts to. So when there are standards and they're in our control, if something doesn't work right, we can adjust to it nimbly and quickly, and we can make that change. And I think that's how we should be able to do it.
And to be clear, I mean, you can, number one, you can add to the standards, but also you can change them. One of the issues that's come up is with the federal government, the requirements to get a waiver from the federal No Child Left Behind Act, or whether a Race to the Top grant would be in jeopardy. And there were sort of two ways that the federal government set it up. One was you could adopt the Common Core. Number two, you could set up another set of standards, and as long as your higher ed system signed off on them, they would pass muster. So, those are sort of the two tracks that you could pursue, and you could, borrow from the Common Core and add as much as your own as you want, as long as it still passed muster with your higher ed system. Other questions? Yes?
I wanted to ask Senator Legg, so you were saying that part of the pushback you thought was because there's so many definite people in the public just have so many definitions of what Common Core is. They'll say, I don't like Common Core, and you were saying it could be the standards or the testing, and you said you didn't think it was the standards. So can you be more specific about what you think we're getting pushback from?
Sure, I mean, well, it's evolved. To say at one point in Florida definitely was the standards because they didn't know what the standards were. And for those, the reporters are from Florida, you'll know that our office, as well as other offices, we did an aggressive push to kind of get the standards out there and to get public comment. Once we kind of got the standards out to the public domain, the pushback on the standards kind of went away, and what arose was a pushback on the curriculum. Then once individuals realized that, well, the curriculum is not really set by the state, it's set by the local standard, and these exemplars that were floating around there on the internet, when they realized, well, that's, it took kind of a little process. Once that kind of pushback kind of subsided, now the issue is testing. And I think the real probably core of where we're seeing the pushback, and I think it's the legitimate concern, is regarding the assessment/testing. What are we assessing? How are we testing? And then where you get a lot of concern is what are you using that information for? And there is the issue of data privacy. That's a legitimate concern, but I think we've kind of worked through some of those issues. But what does that mean when you get this data? What does it mean to the teacher? What does it mean to the school? What does it mean for that individual child? Those are issues that we've wrestled with in Florida for the last 15 years, as those of you in Florida know, under then Governor Bush, when we kind of laid out the first A+ plan in '98. And we've did advances and retreats, and I think this is where kind of the new front, and probably the more harder front of getting through of the concern is what is that assessment. And the reason why I say that is because that means something to that parent when their third grader is not allowed to move forward. That means something when they get that data back that shows that their 5th grade child who gets all A's in school but yet is below grade level. Where's the disconnect? Who's at fault? Is it the assessment? Is it the teacher? Is it the school? So those are the real challenging issues. And I know there will be not one single session that can ever solve that problem. It will be an ongoing discussion from now on to get through that. And then you have the technology issues, and I believe that's a matter of getting us up to the level that we need to, and that's about money and implementation, professional development, which is the ever-evolving level of education.
Thanks. One thing I wanted to ask each of you, if you would sort of wear your political analyst hat for a second, and maybe give me a 30-second answer to this. Is political momentum moving for or against the Common Core in 2015, and why? Governor, we'll start with you.
I think that the political momentum around Common Core in general is going to become a part of the presidential discussion. If the people out there now are going to get in the race, it's going to be a wonderful, healthy discussion for the country. And I think the jury's still out, but I do believe that high standards are being embraced by everybody in the country.
Lieutenant Governor?
I agree. I think that what you're going to see is as more and more states begin to implement Common Core in this coming school year, you're going to see a lot of the same questions that have arisen in Florida and North Carolina and New York and other places. You're going to see those questions come up. So you're going to see more people being aware that Common Core even exists. So unless these questions are addressed appropriately, unless we have transparency, I think you're going to see more people against it. However, as the governor said, I think it's good dialogue to have, because people will all say we want to have the highest standards in the world, and it's just raising the whole level of awareness of education in general across the country, which is a good thing.
Senator?
I think it's moving against it, and so what we'll have to do is, do we change the mirror or do we change our image? That's going to be our discussion. Do we just change do we change the results to say, yeah, we are doing as well as we think we are? So.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was a great panel. Really appreciate you all. I'll let Caroline come back over.